I've been making it a point to play more of the universally acclaimed or influential retro JRPGs, with Phantasy Star falling into at least one of those categories. Being separated by console from its competition, Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest on the NES, Phantasy Star was the first full-scale RPG developed and published by SEGA. It was released in 1987, a year after the first Dragon Quest, and the same year as Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest II. I played the Sega Aegis Switch release of Phantasy Star, released in 2018. Phantasy Star quickly became one of the most ambitious games developed for the Master System, with its push to include 3D graphics, something the console's rival the NES couldn't do at the time, and its enhanced soundtrack if used with the Master System's FM chip. It also became one of the most expensive Master System games on the market due to its 4 megabit chip and save battery. Despite the larger chip, the team was constantly battling memory constraints, masterfully navigating the hardware to create not only a beautiful world, but a full adventure that's truly impressive for its time. As described in the manual, under the democratic rule of King Shiec, the Algol system's people led happy, prosperous lives. But with the introduction of a new religion from an outside galaxy promising immortality to all who joined, things started to change. King Shiec became the first to join. Shiec's personality began to change and corrupt. His new policies resulted in businesses shutting down and towns falling apart. With his strong political grip on his people, and evil creatures beginning to roam the Algol system, King Shiec turned into an evil tyrant. The game begins with Alice mourning the loss of her brother Nero, who was just attacked and killed by Shiec's soldiers after he attempted to discover Shiec's evil secrets. She then sets out to find a man named Odin in order to help her take revenge for Nero and to save herself and the people from Shiec's control. Phantasy Star did a lot to craft a unique world, especially for its time. Not only did it have a strong female lead that was a standout from the typical damsel in distress, but it combined a medieval setting seen in most early D&D and RPG stories with futuristic sci-fi elements. Despite a lot of details described by the manual being missing from the game itself, it makes up for that by expressing the detail within the game's world. The Algol system contains 3 planets, Palma, Motavia, and Dezoris, each with their own unique biomes. The first town, Kamenit, introduces you to this futuristic sci-fi world, with its clean paved paths, dome-shaped homes, all elevated off the ground and connected by conveyor belt to the other towns and spaceport. These areas are under Shiec's control, with all exits being guarded by his soldiers, keeping a constant watchful eye on those in the area. These are contrasted against the decaying and forgotten towns, unable to make money due to Shiec's harmful economic policies. Despite the wealth inequality, all towns are surrounded by walls, and anything outside of those walls are crawling with monster encounters. This does a great job expressing a world filled with strife and confusion as a result of this new outside religion's influence. If you properly explore the starting town, you'll find a small warehouse introducing you to how dungeons operate, a few shops selling armor and helpful items, and a place to heal and revive party members. By talking to an NPC in the northwest corner of town, you'll receive a Laconian pot that will help you progress. This reinforces early in the game that talking to people is a helpful tool that provides you with important items and knowledge about the world and how to navigate it. Once you leave town, Phantasy Star has a very unfriendly start. The first main goal given to you at the start of the game is to find and recruit Odin. However, that's not the first thing you're able to do. The overworld surrounding Kamenit is home to a bunch of different enemies. All but 2 of those enemies you can take in a fight, with the rest killing you in 2 hits. I was surprised to lose my very first encounter in the game. I then explored south of Kamenit to find even stronger enemies I couldn't take in a fight. The first hour was filled with me just grinding for levels and money right at the city limits just to be able to play the game. Most areas and dungeons currently accessible in Palma result in dead ends. Instinctively, it made sense for me to explore the first area of the game, but in order to progress, you actually need to get to the second planet, Motavia, as soon as possible in order to recruit another character to your party. Not knowing that, I explored everything I could in the first world, and everything I could in the second with Alice, until I encountered enemies I just couldn't defeat alone. It left me with this nagging feeling that I wasn't playing the game correctly, until finally coming across the second party member, Meow. What you're supposed to do after leaving Kamenit is to go to Scion's second-hand shop. you need to try to buy secrets from the clerk 3 times before he sells you the road pass. There's multiple times in the game where you need to interact with important people 3 times before the plot can progress, adding an extra layer of obscurity to progression. I can just imagine someone asking twice, and after given a similar response twice, leaving, thinking that there was some other means of progression. The road pass then allows you passage to the spaceport in order to travel to the second planet Motavia. You then enter Paseo's shop in order to trade the Laconian pot you got from Kim and Eat for your first party member, Meow. Phantasy Star gets major points in creativity and personality, giving you a cat as a party member. But even after stumbling through the steps needed to recruit Meow, I didn't feel any smarter for it. Not only does it feel counterintuitive, traveling to the second planet in order to get your first additional party member, but the shopkeeper talks about how he has this rare animal and is selling it for an absurd amount of money. It never crossed my mind that that animal would become my party member. Only after talking to the shopkeeper with the Laconian pot will he ask you to trade it for Meow. Nothing really hints at the sequence of events for how important getting your first party member is. Maybe Nero could have mentioned both Odin and Meow during the opening cutscene, or maybe a couple of NPCs could mention a strong warrior animal that matches the description of the shopkeeper's animal. Anything that better hints that this animal is able to fight with you. There should have been a better key item linking itself to Meow rather than just a pot. Maybe you could have gotten animal food as a key item, and when entering the shop, could cause Meow to approach you. Then the seller would cut you a deal. Maybe you find an animal cage key that causes Meow to escape and run out of the store to then join your party. Lastly, if Meow was found in a town on the first planet, seeing as recruiting him is the first major step, then he would be closer to the start of the game and where you get the Laconian pot. One or all of these changes would make the earlier parts of the game easier while being more intuitive to the game's design. Thankfully, after recruiting Meow, this is not only where things started to fall into place, but where the benefits of exploring the rest of the areas first finally came into effect. Once I found Meow, I already had the information from exploring to make consistent progress. In its favor, Phantasy Star is very open. If you aren't making a direct form of progression, you'll still be gathering information, experience, money, and items that'll be useful later on. Having money to purchase important key items is relied on just as much as finding them in the dungeons. While buying key items is much less exciting, any time spent gaining experience and money eventually rewards you back. Once you get to this point, the game really starts to open up, and navigating back and forth through different towns, dungeons, and planets can be really fun, even providing you with plenty of side objectives. Entering one of the many dungeons transitions gameplay from a top-down perspective into a 3D first-person perspective. You'll be navigating through maze-like areas and fighting monsters, usually ending in important key items or people to talk to. The push for 3D dungeons came with the sacrifice of detail. Dungeons look simple and remain the same throughout the game, minus a few color swaps. You'll be spending a lot of time in them, with the later ones being long, confusing, and monotonous. You'll eventually obtain the dungeon and magic keys used to open up new areas in dungeons previously blocked. What's annoying is that they're used way too much. Using locked doors to check your progression until you have the keys makes sense, but when they're used multiple times within the same dungeons, it's just redundant. Any extra locked doors only serve to slow the game down as you repeatedly go into your inventory and select the key to open each door that the game already knows you'd have in order to reach this point. What's even worse is that they close as soon as you leave the floor. If you have the key and use it, you still have the key. Just keep the doors open and remove the extra doors. With the lack of a map in the original release, if you're gonna play this retro JRPG in the modern era, it leaves you with an important choice to make. Do you draw maps by hand, look them up outside of the game, or play one of the newer releases with an auto map feature? Maybe they couldn't include a map due to hardware limitations, or maybe they wanted the experience to more similarly parallel D&D's pen and paper exploration. The last few pages of the manual recommend making a map of every dungeon, so it at least acknowledges and recommends a way of playing its initial release. Whatever the reason, these dungeons are not designed to be friendly, and will get you lost at every turn if you don't find a way to map out their layouts. I think this is where the game fails to age as gracefully as its competition at the time. While Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest dungeons weren't perfect, it was much easier to get a sense of direction with its top-down perspective and landmarks. In addition, those dungeons were more varied in their environments, with level design utilizing their locations. Though too tedious for me, I've always respected the sense of satisfaction provided with this kind of dungeon crawling. There's a distinct difference between how you explore dungeons for the first time and how you efficiently walk to your destination after the area has been fully mapped out. When visiting a game like this now, I feel it's necessary to at least include the option to auto-map out the area, so the addition of this feature in future releases is an invaluable inclusion that helps give the game some more lasting appeal. Phantasy Star features simple turn-based combat with some pretty tough enemies. I previously mentioned how the starting area featured enemies that were too strong, but once you catch up to the game in that first hour, everything after that generally does a good job being balanced and remaining a constant threat. Characters have their own roles, with Alice having average stats in magic, Meow being a strong support healer, Odin having the strongest attack but unable to use magic, and Lutz having weak stats and strong magic. There's a good amount of spells in the game that you'll consistently be unlocking. The constant combat challenge, along with the long length of time spent away from towns, forces you to be careful and deliberate when using magic. Even when it comes to saving magic points for the character's exit and fly spells, allowing quick travel out of a dungeon and back to the last church visited respectively. Combat shares the first-person perspective used in dungeons. Enemies and party members' attacks are quick and combat is fast. There's no complicated status list or debuffs to deal with, keeping things simple. Party members and enemies are able to stun with certain attacks. Later in the game, enemies get a lot of health and have much higher evade rates, frequently dodging attacks. This, in combination with enemies and party members' attacks hitting at random, can make some fights drag on. Not being able to choose your target makes the game harder, but in what feels like a superficial way. The more enemies you're put up against, the higher the chance you won't be able to finish off an enemy just one hit from death, creating some annoying moments where you took too much damage than expected. Plus, you don't get the positive feeling in maximizing your damage by choosing specific targets. Other than that, I like the simplicity of combat. Every option felt useful, whether it be attacking, using items, or magic. Support magic was helpful with healing or putting up temporary walls to dodge enemy attacks. Damage magic was useful in hitting enemies twice or targeting each enemy once. Even the talk command and telepathy spell seemed a bit ahead of its time, allowing you to communicate with certain enemies, ending encounters, and gathering helpful information as an alternative to combat or running. After enemies are defeated, chests are left behind, and it wasn't a mechanic I liked. It makes less sense for monsters to be carrying entire treasure chests around with them than if some money was automatically collected after combat. More importantly, it slows the game down, asking you if you want to open the chest after every victory. What's worse, our chests have a chance of being trapped that will damage the party upon opening. Opening chests after defeating enemies is the only way to consistently earn money, so there's no reason not to open every single chest. So unless you want to use Meow's trap spell to disarm every single chest before opening it, slowing down the process even further, you'll just have to take the damage. If they really wanted chests to appear after combat, then enemies should always guarantee you money after the win. Afterwards, chests could have a chance to appear. This would guarantee you get money, while occasionally rewarding you with even more from a chest. Here you would have the choice to walk away from it, take damage from a trap, or disarm it. Successfully exploring the Algol system results in mostly consistent progression. It even allows you to save the game at any time with multiple saves, which is really impressive for the time. However, this is an old school JRPG with limited item descriptions and pioneering game design. It stumbles in quite a few moments of obscurity, best looked up in a guide to save time and headaches. The worst aspect of the game is how slow progression is. There are hours and hours of footage of me just walking back and forth from town to dungeon because enemies drain your resources so fast. Unless you play the SEGA Aegis version of Phantasy Star, you need to be aware of just how slow and monotonous this game can get. SEGA Aegis mode increases your movement speed, along with increasing experience and money gained in battle. It can be seen as an easy mode, but after going through the footage of me just walking back and forth through the same areas again and again, I see it as a quality of life update rather than an easy mode, streamlining progression and saving you hours of your life that you won't get back. This resulted in me reaching a breaking point of boredom. I looked up a guide toward the last stretch of the game, as my patience was waning and I just wanted to finish it. To its credit, the final stretch was interesting. They build up LASIK during the introduction and events of the game, just to widen the scope right at the end. As I wrap up talking about gameplay, I think about all the small things that didn't frustrate me, but halted or slowed down my experience. My intention isn't to pick apart every minor inconvenience in a game released in 1987, rather it's to acknowledge the things that have since been improved as the genre got better with time and stronger hardware. A lot of in-game information is lacking due to either limited space on the cartridge or lack of screen space when localizing the game from Japanese to English. Names of certain weapons and spells had to be heavily abbreviated in order to fit into the text box's character limits, resulting in a few odd or confusing translations. For example, things like tele, abbreviated TELE, doesn't mean teleport, but telepathy. Trap isn't an offensive spell, but a trap disarm spell, and the spell buy is for guaranteeing escape from combat. This, combined with no in-game descriptions or stats of items, armors, and spells present in the game, means it lacks important information needed to play the game efficiently without seeking other resources. In order to figure out the stats of weapons and armor, you need to first check your character stats, then buy and equip the gear, then check your character stats again to see if the number went up or down. There's no way of knowing if the gear is better, or if a specific character can equip it without first making the purchase, meaning you could be wasting your money on something you can't even use. Buying and selling items, reviving and healing party members can only be done one at a time. Reviving party members and healing them also has to be done in separate buildings. This has you slowly repeating dialogue back to back, turning a process repeated throughout the entire game that should only take a few seconds into something that takes minutes. Most towns have multiple shops, each with different items for sale. I think the armory, secondhand, and first-hand shops could have different sprites to make them more identifiable. There were plenty of times where multiple shops were lined up right next to each other, and I walked into the wrong shop, having to leave and check the next one. Talking to NPCs requires you walk in front of them, transitioning into a first-person perspective, then transitioning back after the conversation. This is another example to me how at the time they prioritized the presentation of the game over its function. It's extremely minor, but what you lose by having to awkwardly maneuver in front of the NPCs and wait for the transition scenes is made up for by showing off its graphical detail in the environments and NPC designs, all different depending on your location. Running from fights has you take a few steps back, which is creatively realistic, but those steps count towards the next encounter, so you could find yourself running from a battle and auto taking a few steps back into another battle. There are some secret dungeon walls that you can pass through, which thankfully aren't required, but look no different from any other wall. Same with the ice digger you get later in the game. Some walls you use to pass through, but aren't visibly shown to be any different from other walls. I think they accomplished their mission to make Phantasy Star one of the best looking games on the Master System. Even with its extreme hardware limitations, I think they went above and beyond to make a clear, detailed, and animated world with a variety of colorful locations. It maintains the large scale of traveling to different planets, each with their own biomes, towns, and dungeons. Environments like water and lava animate on Palma, and antlions move and prey on Motavia. Most impressively for me is that all enemies have attack animations, some of which even have two. I love this, as I've always thought more could have been done to make the static images of enemies in countless JRPG games over the years feel more lively, so it's truly impressive to see fully animated attack animations being done this early on 8-bit hardware in 1987. The only noticeable concession is that multiple enemies share the same sprite, but with HP individually represented on the top right of the combat menu. There's a wide variety of enemies that come from a variety of locations in Phantasy Star. The more boring enemies are D&D mainstays like bats, giant spiders, and skeletons. They're at least explained in the world as a result of the New Religion's influence, with some more creative creatures encountered later on. Some creatures are natural inhabitants of the world, like antlions capturing prey out in the sand dunes, flies and scorpions roaming the plains, and dangerous water creatures occupying the sea. What I appreciate the most were the other intelligent life and henchmen of Shiec. Natives to Motavia and Dezoris further craft a believable world without any extra exposition. It shows intelligent life existed before humans arrived on the other planets. Encounters with the Motavians are outside of towns, showing they're an outcast group able to survive in the harsh desert climate. Dezorians appear both as enemy encounters and as allies with their own Dezorian towns. During encounters, you're able to chat with both of them, showing that they don't necessarily want to fight. Shiec's faction has an oppressive influence, but there aren't a lot of enemy encounters with Shiec's forces. Shiec is the king of the Algol system, and as a result has a lot of influence over each planet. There are a few encounters with Shiec's robot cops, but I think that they could have gone so much further, creating unique enemies that take advantage of the plot conflict using Shiec and the sci-fi elements. For one, Shiec has soldiers patrolling towns, so what's stopping him from sending different classes of soldiers or hitmen out to Alice and their party in order to stop them? Aggressive recon or mining bots could also be a part of Shiec's tools, so he can gather intel or resources from the comfort of his castle. The only visual criticisms that come to mind are Phantasy Star's dungeons. I wish there could have been more detail in each dungeon, but they made an intentional choice to use 3D graphics to make their game stand out as something that couldn't be done on its console's competitor, the Famicom. I believe it was the right choice and a smart choice for them at the time, but the simple and similar dungeon designs used throughout the game hurts it from both a gameplay and visual standpoint when looked from a modern perspective. It makes navigating dungeons feel tiresome and difficult with no identifiable landmarks to visualize progress. The dungeons lose charm when compared to the varied environments of its contemporaries, though the key thing being that its push for graphics didn't sacrifice the game's quality or length. The original release of Phantasy Star was in 1987 for the Sega Master System. It's had plenty of ports over the years, most of them stayed in Japan. Sega released a Mega Drive port in 1994 in limited quantities. Later ports were also released on the Phantasy Star collection for Sega Saturn, Game Boy Advance, and PlayStation 2, with the Game Boy Advance version being the only collection released outside of Japan. Phantasy Star later released on Sonic's Ultimate Genesis collection for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. All of these re-releases of Phantasy Star are ports of the original Master System version with a few notable changes. In 2018, Phantasy Star Ages released on the Nintendo Switch as part of the Sega Ages series of re-releases. This version seeks to improve the original Phantasy Star experience with added features and options. Phantasy Star Ages includes Ages mode, increasing the amount of experience and money gained in battle. This could be seen as an easy mode, but to me it's a quality of life addition. It helps streamline progression by limiting the constant back and forth grinding necessary in the original version, making it my recommended way to play. Phantasy Star Ages also includes a built-in auto mapper and new character HP and MP bars. You have the freedom to toggle the map on or off at any time, giving you the option to create your own maps like the original release intended, or play with modern conveniences as the game adds to the map as you explore. This addition is invaluable, both modernizing and making this older game much more accessible to everyone. Ages also includes the option to use the FM Sound Chip's rendition of the soundtrack, which is a first for the West. It's great finally being able to experience one of the flagship features shown off during its first release. The FM Sound Chip expands the previously limited range, making a noticeable and quality improvement over the original soundtrack. Other additions include a faster run speed, bestiary, and built-in pause screen that gives information on all items, equipment, and abilities in the game. This translates a lot of info that was either in the manual or missing into a quickly accessible glossary. The biggest praise I can give this release is the amount of invaluable additions, while having the ability to include or exclude any number of them. It allows you to customize your gameplay and convenience, while preserving the original experience at every turn. Phantasy Star Ages used the original release as a base, while adding both internal and external features to help improve the experience. It's certainly the best official Western release, but not one without flaws and missed opportunities. For one, limited space on the hardware and screen resulted in an inconsistent or abbreviated translation. This could have been their chance to add a more accurate translation back into the game, instead leaving the original untouched. Ages doesn't include save states. Rather, when you pause the game, it creates a single state that resumes if you exit the game and choose to continue. I'd argue this has less utility and less convenience compared to the save states that have become a standard when porting retro games to modern hardware. While dungeons have the newly added automap feature, the same can't be said for the overworld. When you're exploring the overworld, the automapper is replaced with a map of the Algol system, simply telling you what planet you're on. Maps were featured in the original release in the game's manual. Seeing as a lot of the manual's information was included in the Ages glossary in the pause menu, I don't see why they couldn't have added the world maps in the game or in the glossary. It also would have been nice to have seen more additions like auto battle, fast forward, or the ability to buy items in bulk or heal your party members all at once. The most egregious omission is not removing any of the game's soft locks. The player can take certain actions in the game that completely halts their progression, making them unable to beat the game. These things are even acknowledged in the official online manual for Phantasy Star Ages. This was their opportunity to remove these soft locks, but they chose not to address them in order to provide an authentic recreation of the game in its original form. Up to this point, I loved the quality of life additions and the option to turn them on or off. Issues that result in the player permanently unable to make progress, no matter how easy or how hard they are to cause, are failures in game design that, given the opportunity, should have been addressed. Overall, I'm happy with Phantasy Star Ages' attempt to modernize a game from 1987 while preserving its original release. But I can't help but feel that it's a half step. I imagine the feeling is exponentially so if you live in Japan. In 2003, an enhanced remake of Phantasy Star, titled Phantasy Star Generations 1, was released for the PlayStation 2, featuring updated graphics, music, and a more fleshed out story. With the stronger hardware available on the PlayStation 2, Phantasy Star Generations has this late 90s, early 2000s anime art style in its cutscenes and character portraits, with detailed sprite work, true 3D dungeons, and fully animated enemies and attacks. The music also saw brand new arrangement versions that carry strong MIDI sounds, giving it this retro but evolved feeling. The game features a largely expanded story and world, resulting in more character development and a richer story. Because of the better hardware, a new translation could have no longer been limited by space and memory. Generations also features all of the quality of life changes seen in JRPGs around this time. It has a revamped battle system, enemies are rebalanced, more options are available to the player, dungeons can be auto-mapped, and auto-battle has been added. It breaks my heart that this version was never localized and is lost to time even in Japan. When I played Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, I've had the luxury of playing newer remakes available on a variety of consoles. This version of Phantasy Star looks to hold up extremely well and could have been ported and built upon to make it inarguably the best version of the game. Having a definitive best way to play a game available and accessible is important to me, so the fact that there's a perfectly good remake on the PlayStation 2, and it's not the version used in future ports, is wild to me. Instead of localizing, updating, and porting this PlayStation 2 remake that already fixed and modernized just about every aspect of the original from the ground up, they're taking the Master System original and duct taping a few new features that are welcome but don't mean so much when it's done to a version of a game that has a much harder time of being enjoyed in the modern day. Thankfully, there are passionate fans at Phantasy Star Cave that have provided a fan translation for those English speakers seeking a way to play this tragically forgotten version of Phantasy Star Generations. Phantasy Star has proven itself to me as one of the most ambitious and influential retro JRPGs for its time. It contains some of the best visuals, animations, and audio quality I've seen from a game released in 1987, and it doesn't sacrifice its free open world to accomplish that feat. Beyond the surface lies a game that has simple yet challenging combat, requiring focus and resource management. However, it overstayed its welcome with a ton of repeated grinding, bland repetitive dungeons, and an obscure or slow progression that I just wasn't enjoying once I reached a certain point in the game. I left the game content visiting a piece of history, sad that there was no way to officially play Phantasy Star Generations in the West, and curious to see where the series goes from here. Thanks for watching the video. If you want to see more like it, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. I also stream on Twitch at twitch.tv/RyanBeardy, follow me on Twitter at RyanBeardy, and I have a Discord with the links below.